As it is known, Poland had been an important supporter of Kiev from the first days of the Ukrainian war. Since Warsaw shared the same fate with Kiev in history, it took its place on the side of Ukraine without hesitation. With the start of the war, the brave hearts of Poland threw themselves into the Ukrainian front lines. The Ukrainian war is home to many volunteer soldiers. Among the volunteer fighters, soldiers from Poland occupy a very important place. Let's examine the effects of the Polish volunteers at the turning point of the war between Ukraine and Russia and what they put Putin in. Buses of Ukrainian refugees flowed across the border into Poland, while groups of seemingly determined little men were heading in the opposite direction to fight the Russians. Most looked like Ukrainian immigrants in their 20s and 30s. However, some could also be heard speaking other languages. Most of them had black tactical boots dangling from their gym bags. These men were responding to the call of Friends of Peace and Democracy to join their new brigade, the International Ukrainian Regional Defense Legion, and help them fight the Russians. Polish citizen soldiers were joining Ukraine's new International Foreign Fighters Brigade. These included Poles, who compared Russia's invasion of Ukraine to the Soviet Union's brutal invasion of Poland. In October, Vladimir Rogov, head of the We Together with Russia movement, said about 5,000 Polish soldiers were in the battle line in Zaporizhia. Rogov pointed out that many Polish-speaking citizens are being treated in some hospitals, especially in the Kiev-controlled city of Zaporizhia. As the Ukrainian war escalated, the number of Polish volunteers increased considerably. It is alleged that there are currently thousands of Polish volunteers on Ukrainian soil. This figure was said to have last exceeded 10,000 volunteers. Volunteers managed to stop Vladimir Putin's army on the front lines several times. This success of the volunteer soldiers shocked Vladimir Putin. The addition of the success of the volunteer soldiers to the strength of the Kiev army created a cold shower effect on Putin. In addition, the Russians who oppose Vladimir Putin's wrong war decision are fighting on the side of Ukraine. Polish and Russian volunteers fighting for Ukraine will conduct joint combat operations. The Polish Volunteer Union and the Russian Volunteer Union announced this cooperation. Soldiers of the two formations are currently conducting joint training and coordination. The Poles and Russians will likely be involved in the operations of the Defense Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. Ukrainian intelligence officials had previously included Belarusian and Russian volunteers in joint operations. More and more foreigners are ready to privately help Ukraine repel the aggression of the Kremlin. The number of volunteers is so high that volunteer associations are formed from them on a national basis. The Polish Volunteer Union has its own material and technical basis and symbols. Their symbol is the emblem of the Cavalry of Death Cavalry Squadron, which the Poles formed in 1920 to fight against the Bolsheviks. In contrast, the Russian Volunteer Corps was created in 2022 from Russians who wanted to fight on the Ukrainian side. In the past week, soldiers of the Russian Volunteer Corps reported that they conducted an operation on the territory of Bryansk region of the Russian Federation. Volunteer fighters play a key role in both frontline and cross-border operations. Let's take a closer look at the Polish volunteers evacuating wounded troops from the besieged Soledar. Duda and the crack crew of volunteers remained unaffected by the horror at the front. Polish volunteer Damian Duda explains what motivated him to risk his life to help soldiers fighting against Russia in Soledar. Duda states that this war is not just Ukraine's war. Duda said a war between the civilization of death and the civilization of life. Clashes have been going on for weeks as Russia declared victory in Soledar in eastern Ukraine, and Ukraine insisted the war was still not over, despite being one of the most dangerous places on the planet right now. Few volunteers still feel compelled to travel there and help out as much as they can. Duda is one of the team of 5 Polish volunteers who spent 8 days treating and evacuating wounded Ukrainian soldiers who had recently joined the relentless war. Duda and his team work as a volunteer paramedic at Soledar. The team picks up wounded soldiers on the front line, stabilizes their condition, transports them to safety in a special armored vehicle, and then takes the wounded to a hospital. On the other hand, Duda, who first came to eastern Ukraine in 2014, is used to the risks of dangerous volunteering. There was massive Russian propaganda in Poland at that time. Duda wanted to see for himself whether they were really Nazis in Ukraine. Duda said, "I met the fighters of the Azov battalion in Mariupol and realized that there were no Nazis and that this was purely Russian disinformation. On the contrary, I saw that the separatists were members of the Russian army. Duda then returned to Poland and gathered a team of volunteers. Duda then came to Ukraine to provide frontline medical assistance. When the total invasion started, Duda and his volunteer friends took their backpacks and got into their vehicles to help. In the early days of the full-scale war, they worked with the Kiev 26th Territorial Defense Battalion and stood with this battalion at a checkpoint near Kherson until the city was liberated. Duda and his team's next target was Donbass. Duda and his team planned to form a medical battalion of healthcare workers in Poland to work in Ukraine. The help of Polish volunteers is undoubtedly very important. However, the support of the Warsaw government cannot be ignored. As a frontline state, Poland has played a crucial role since Russia began massing troops on the Ukrainian border in preparation for the invasion. Due to its geographical location bordering with Ukraine and Belarus, Poland has become an important route for Western supplies to Ukraine and a safe haven for Ukrainian refugees. On February 24, 2022, when Russian tanks entered Ukraine, neighboring Poland opened its border to millions of Ukrainians fleeing their country and ordinary Poles lining up to welcome refugees at their homes. Like the Baltic states, Poland quickly became a key defender of Ukraine's cause, with the EU and NATO sending large quantities of weapons. Poland's size, location, and infrastructure make it the West's most important gateway to Ukraine. That is why Poland has become the main transit country for international aid. In addition, Poland led lobbying efforts to impose harsh sanctions against Russia and support Ukraine with strong political, economic, and military assistance. It has donated major military aid to Ukraine, including the main channel of military supply and 300 tanks from its own stockpiles. Polish leaders were among the first to arrive in Kiev as artillery still bombarded. The city and the country supports Ukraine's early accession to the European Union. As it is known, Poland formed a tank coalition shortly after the war started with the participation of various countries. The coalition expanded, and the support for Ukraine increased. Now, some of the 14 Leopard 2 tanks that Poland promised to Ukraine are about to reach the territory of Kiev. Poland became the first Western ally to transfer modern Leopard tanks to Ukraine. Ukraine took delivery of the remaining 10 of the 14 Leopard 2 tanks that Poland had promised after Ukrainian soldiers completed their training to operate this equipment. In summary, its will. It is the energy that Poland strongly believes it has to do with everything possible to support Ukraine to achieve what Ukraine defines as victory and is willing to expend it to achieve it. Its army equipped with Western tanks and the difficulties it will face to take Crimea in the most realistic and objective ways. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has sharply emphasized the Ukraine is likely to regain control of Russian-controlled Crimea within 2023. Contrary to the thinking of some other NATO officials, Wallace said Ukraine is likely to successfully retake Crimea, which Putin illegally took control of in 2014. This year, as Russian forces run out of necessary equipment, what is seen on the battlefield is that if the Russian forces are punched in the right place, they will really collapse. Russia could send tens of thousands of young men to their deaths, which is exactly what Russia has done since the beginning of the war. But the Ukrainian army, with its modern weapons, needs to put a stop to it. At the same time, the UK Defence Minister pointed out that Ukraine is ready to make longer-term plans to improve its military capacity. In this context, Western countries should continue to support the supply of arms and funds to Ukraine without pressuring the leaders in Kiev to negotiate with Russia or make concessions. But the truth is that the West is running out of defense equipment that it can donate. This means that the UK and other countries are forced to buy more guns from their national stockpile rather than donate them. So by what methods can Ukraine get Crimea back? The continued progress of Ukrainian military efforts seems to surprise many observers more than a year after the war. Overall, Ukraine's somewhat unexpected battlefield success has led to some effective counterattacks and the ability to retake certain key areas controlled by the Russian military. However, the Ukrainian military may face some limitations when it comes to fully holding the newly won territories. Besides critical weapons, the Pentagon and other allies are sending tactical trucks and other logistics and transport assets to Ukraine. Perhaps the better advance progress or establish forward bases of operations and hold new territory. In addition, Ukraine's partners established a new logistics supply line for the Ukrainian army. However, Ukrainian forces will likely need more heavily armored vehicles to break through the acquired territory. After sending a small number of Bradley combat vehicles and highly effective anti-armor weapons, the Pentagon decided to set up a special production line for Ukraine to build Abrams main battle tanks. Ukrainian fighters have already proven quite capable of destroying Russian tanks from scattered or various attack positions. However, destroying tanks is a little different from reclaiming and holding territory, because this is a mission that probably requires more heavy armor, combined arms maneuvering. For example, a single group of armored vehicles such as Bradley's Abrams or German Leopards can break through a Russian defensive line. But the Ukrainian army will be forced to maintain control of the area without more mechanized or more heavily armored vehicles. Larger mechanized formations will likely be needed to seize and hold Crimea. So when will the tanks promised to Ukraine arrive? The Ukrainians will eventually get enough tanks to field a large mechanized force. They will also be able to leave the fence and gain sufficient gains with offensive operations to remain successful and operational for a long time. Given their success so far, it seems entirely possible that Ukrainian forces will be able to adequately operate for quite some time. But it may take several years for all of the Abrams to arrive in Ukraine. Despite this, the demoralization of the Russian forces and the lack of combined arms maneuver greatly raise Ukraine's hopes of long-term success. If Ukraine takes all the weapons promised to it and sets up a good strategy, it will be able to take back Crimea. So what is the main problem in reclaiming Crimea? The biggest problem in this regard is still the logistics route of the Russian army between Ukraine and Crimea. Although the Ukrainian army cut the Russian supply lines in other directions of the front line, the line from the Crimea is still standing and continues to be used actively. Western experts suggested that Ukrainian forces could achieve better results in their offensive against Russia if they cut off the Russian supply line along Zaporizhia and Kherson. Experts analyzed Ukraine's advances and counterattacks. Afterwards, they explained that Ukraine could be in an advantageous position if it targets Russia's supply line in the midst of the ongoing war in Bakhmut. As Ukraine continues to launch counterattacks to retake Russian-controlled areas, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky announced this month that his country will have to wait to launch the main counterattack. Experts had previously said that waiting was a good strategy to help the Ukrainian military take time to plan a counterattack, adding that the attack would begin when the generals felt it was the right time. This is the right moment when all the Russians' Lestrillian mating supply lines are cut. If the Ukrainian army also cuts the last remaining supply route of the Russians in the south, the ammunition of the Russian army will be exhausted and will not be able to replace it. In particular, the issue of the liberation of Crimea, which is the main target of the Ukrainian army, depends on this. Although the Ukrainian army has worn down Russian targets in Crimea with successful drone and missile attacks, this attrition is still not fully effective. Ukraine is putting a lot of effort into the expected counterattack. It makes the best use of satellite images and intelligence from key regions and creates the right strategies compared to the strategists of the Russian army. Ukrainian strategists proved their effectiveness many times during the war. They will show their effectiveness again in the expected counterattack. In this way, Ukraine will be able to get the victory it expects as soon as possible and perhaps put an end to this fierce war. Warsaw is expanding its production of the 155mm Krab self-propelled tracked howitzer, which Poland has transferred to Ukraine by establishing a new production line at the Bumur-Labady defense establishment in Kolos in southern Poland. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense, Mariusz Błaszczak, announced this at a joint press conference during their visit to the Bumur-Labady defense establishment. Among the applause of the company's employees, Morawiecki said Bumur-Labady will begin production of the Krab system. The Prime Minister added that this would allow the company to recruit new employees. Błaszczak, on the other hand, said that in addition to the Huta Stalowa Wola defense facility in Stalowa, Wola Krab systems will now be produced in Bumur-Labady. Błaszczak has ordered another batch of Krab. This weapon was also ordered by the Ukrainians as it proved itself in the hands of brave Ukrainian soldiers and effectively protected Ukraine from Russian aggression, he said. After the Russian full-scale offensive on Ukraine began, Poland transferred to Ukraine a 3-battery, 155mm Krab self-propelled artillery system. Then in June, Ukraine and Poland signed an agreement for Kiev to purchase about 60 Crab systems. The deal is worth 2.7 billion zloty, and Ukraine became the first export customer of such weapons. The fact that Crab also serves in the Polish armed forces and its performance in the Ukrainian war shows how reliable this weapon is. In addition, since the ammunition used for Crab can also be used for HIMARS, Poland's increasing production capacity to provide Crab and ammunition to Ukraine will greatly contribute to Ukraine's war effort in Ukraine, as in previous major conflicts. Artillery is the biggest killer on the battlefield, and artillery shelling caused perhaps 80% of the casualties on both sides. But even though Ukraine has fewer guns that fire, fewer round, and use the same guns as their Russian rivals, with some notable exceptions, they seem to do more damage. So how is this possible? Since the start of the war, Russia has had a huge advantage in artillery, with roughly twice as many guns and, more importantly, huge stockpiles of ammo. These numbers have changed over time, but all put Russia significantly ahead in terms of rounds fired. US officials reported that Russia estimates that it spends 20,000 rounds a day. Despite spending 47 rounds for Ukraine, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said in February that Russia fired about 4 times as many rounds as Ukraine. In March, EU officials said Russia fired 40 to 50,000 rounds a day, while for Ukraine, the number was 5 to 6,000. Estonia, which supplies bullets to Ukraine, estimates that Russia fires 20 to 60,000 rounds and Ukraine fires between 2 to 7,000. So Russia probably fires 4 to 9 times as many rounds as Ukraine. Still, Russia suffered much more casualties. To take just the number, recently leaked Pentagon documents show that between 189,500 and 223,000 Russians were killed or wounded. Much of this can be explained by the fact that Russia's operation is largely on the offensive, while Ukraine is largely on the defensive. Yet we have witnessed largely stagnant conflicts over long periods of time. Russia's artillery advantage should have been reflected in the casualty figures, but that did not happen. The United Kingdom defines the Russian army as a multi-tank artillery army. That is an army that relies on mass artillery for striking power. In the current conflict, they seem to have been defeated by a smaller power. The solution to this paradox is that the two armies use artillery in different ways. Russia mainly adheres to the Soviet doctrine of mass area bombardment, while Ukraine uses artillery systems as a long-range sniper weapon to select individual targets. This was made possible by the widespread use of two innovations: small drones to detect artillery, and inexpensive tablet computers, running software like the Nettl system to direct fire. In 2014, the Ukrainian volunteer organization Army SOS started using its technical skills to help the army. Initially, they helped soldiers support the drones, but soon found that the biggest challenge was to efficiently use the data collected by the drone operators. So they developed Nettl proprietary intelligence mapping software that can run on any Android tablet. Nettl is provided as a tactical system compatible with NATO standards, secure communications, and is used from divisional command to individual vehicles. It maps battle lines and targets, and calculates artillery fire missions. It's specially designed to be used to work with drones, retrieve data, and calculate the required adjustment. The gunner changes angle and azimuth accordingly, and the bullets land on the target.